Good evening, everyone. My name's Joe Beatty, and I'm with Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. We're glad that you could join us for this evening's webinar, the second in the series that we're doing to highlight the collections at our historic sites. As you already know, Classical American Homes Preservation Trust maintains 4 historic homes in 3 states and their remarkable collections of fine and decorative arts. We also engage in original research and collaborative educational programming to develop appreciation of American architecture, landscapes, and to encourage future leaders in historic preservation and public history. This presentation will last approximately 1 hour. In the coming days, we'll make a recording of this webinar available for viewing in case you need to leave early. Now, we have a pretty large turnout tonight, and so to help manage things, I'll ask that you submit any questions that you may have in the Q&A box in the bottom of your window. We'll do our best to answer them. Now, let me introduce my colleague, Grant Quertermous, Classical American Homes Curator and Director of Collections. Grant has worked at a number of notable historic sites, including 4 associated with US presidents, as both an archaeologist and curator. Grant now cares for and curates our collections. Again, thank you for joining us tonight, and now to Mr. Quertermous.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen here and get my PowerPoint presentation ready to go. And actually, I'm going to turn my camera off so I'm not over here in the corner of your screen distracting you from what I'm going to talk about tonight. On June 4th, 1841, a ship carrying 12 crates addressed to John Laurence Manning arrived at Charleston's Exchange Wharf. Received by Kirkpatrick and Company, Manning's agents, the crates contained some of the furniture commissioned for Millford from cabinet maker Duncan Phyfe. Manning was notified of their arrival by Kirkpatrick's clerk, who noted that some of the crates were actually too large to fit in the hold of a canal boat and would await an available steamer for delivery. Once aboard the steamer, they would have traveled up the Cooper River, through the Santee Canal, and further up the Santee River to Manning's Landing, where they would have been loaded onto wagons and carted to Millford. While one focus of my lecture will be the nearly 60 pieces of this original Phyfe Son furniture now back at Millford, I'm also going to look at other objects in the collection that represent a 50-year collecting career by our founder, Richard Jenrette, and his partner, William Thompson. While Millford was the last of the historic properties Mr. Jenrette purchased in 1992, its furnishings and decor are representative of the almost 5 decades he spent pursuing antiques, first British and continental European pieces, and later Americana, including the classical New York furniture that he loved. The first objects I want to discuss tonight are a pair of portraits by Swiss-born Charleston artist Jeremiah Theus, who was active from 1740 to 1774. The sitters are Thomas and Mary Priolo Grimble, painted around the time of their July 1765 marriage. Grimble was an attorney, sheriff of Charleston District, and an officer in the Charleston Artillery Company during the American Revolution. He was taken prisoner by the British during the 1780 siege, and his health declined after imprisonment in Florida, and he tragically died in 1783 at only 38 years old. Mary never remarried, dying in 1813, and they're both buried in a family crypt at St. Philip's Church in Charleston. Mr. Jenrette loved these portraits, and they were displayed at many of his houses. Here's Mr. Grimble at 1 Sutton Place in New York City, then at Edgewater, actually while it was being documented for Historic American Building Survey in 1974, next at Roper House, and finally now in Milford's double parlor. The Grimble portraits represent an early Americana acquisition by Mr. Jenrette, a 1973 purchase from Savannah dealer Jim Williams, who operated a gallery out of the carriage house at his Mercer house, though Williams is probably best known today because of this particular book. Another work in our collection by Theus is this portrait of Richardson family patriarch General Richard Richardson, the great-grandfather of John Laurence Manning. And while the portrait's by Theus, it's clearly a copy of a portrait by another artist, because it doesn't really look like Theus's style. It looks rather flat. But, one source of income for Theus would have been as a copyist for clients. And we know that there were at least 2 versions of this portrait because of the 1835 will of General Richardson's son, which refers to an original portrait of my father, suggesting that there was both an original and a copy, potentially owned by him or potentially owned by two of General Richardson's children. Mr. Jenrette once said that his patron saints were Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, and you can see busts of these founding fathers after Udon throughout Millford, along with copies of Udon's bust of Lafayette and Robert Fulton. The Franklin bust is especially interesting, a very lifelike early 19th century copy after Udon in the library. Once Mr. Jenrette underwent his conversion to Americana in the early 1970s, he began to focus almost exclusively on collecting American decorative arts. However, some of the objects at Millford speak to his earlier collecting focus of British Georgian antiques. For example, this circa 1700 tall case clock by London clockmaker Benjamin Marshall, who was active in London from 1680 to 1720. The case features japanning, a decorative technique that is European in origin, where layers of resin-based varnish were employed to imitate East Asian lacquer work. The clock case also incorporates chinoiserie motifs, so it's a British craftsman's interpretation and almost, in fact, imitation of Chinese and other East Asian artistic traditions and symbols. Another notable example of a British piece in the collection is the circa 1810 giltwood pier mirror in the entrance hall. It's by Thomas Fintham, a London carver, gilder, and frame maker who was active between 1774 and 1825, and it actually features his label. This is a contemporaneous label, but the label on our mirror says the exact same thing. It identifies the location of his business at 136 the Strand near Somerset House in London. Mr. Jenrette wrote that buying Millford was his reward for rescuing the Equitable Insurance Company and making it profitable. And while it may be the final historical property that he purchased, in a way, its collection and decor more closely reflect he and Mr. Thompson's taste than any of the other houses. They didn't utilize a decorator doing it themselves, and Bill actually designed the carpets for the house, produced by Scalamandre, and many of the bed hangings. Other decorative characteristics are the faux marbling on the wall and the classical stenciled design on the wooden floor, both of which are the work of artist Robert Jackson. For all of his houses, Mr. Jenrette sought out objects associated with the original owners, and Millford is no exception. From Manning's descendants and from later owners of the property, he acquired portraits, furniture, silver, personal objects, and even photographs that help us to better understand the previous residents of Millford and interpret its many layers of history. What makes Millford so significant is the sheer quantity of original objects returned to the house and the surviving architectural elements and details. Now, time prevents me from going into detail about Millford's construction, since the focus of this lecture is on the collection, but if that's of interest, I recommend you finding my earlier lecture on YouTube that I delivered for the North Carolina Museum of History about Millford that gives a much more comprehensive overview of those aspects of the property history. John Laurence Manning and his wife Susan Hampton Manning were 22 years old when they started planning Millford, a showplace for them to live surrounded by leisurely pursuits. One gossipy friend described Manning as, quote, an independently wealthy young man with a wife fond of show. So how did a pair of 22-year-olds end up with a house that's considered to be the greatest example of Greek Revival residential architecture in the United States? They had the means to spare no expense and the best architects, builders, and materials available. Susan's wealth is really what made Millford possible, a half share of the Louisiana sugar plantations inherited from the estate of her late father, Wade Hampton I. As Susan's husband, Manning became owner of her property upon their 1838 marriage and used her wealth to construct Millford on land given to him by his Richardson grandparents. From the time of its inception, Millford was always intended to be a showplace, not a working plantation where on-site agriculture sustained its operation, but rather a place to reflect the wealth and status of its owners. Manning was an absentee planter with an agricultural operation 800 miles away in Louisiana. And I shouldn't go any further without acknowledging what made Millford, this lavish furniture and decor, possible was profits from those sugar plantations in Louisiana, where over 600 individuals were enslaved by Manning to grow, harvest, and process the crop. John and Susan's marriage also united two of the most politically prominent and wealthy families of antebellum South Carolina, the Hamptons and the Mannings. You may have caught that Mr. Jenrette's middle name was Hampton, and he later wrote that one of the things that attracted him to Millford was this connection to the Hampton family. His maternal great-grandfather was James Hampton. Now, one of my favorite, actually, I should say, some of my favorite objects in the collection are those that allow us to interpret these layers of history at Millford. An object that I want to highlight right now, that's one of my favorites, is this velvet-lined mahogany silver chest that held the Mannings' flatware. In 1839, they purchased a large service of flatware from Charleston silversmiths Hayden and Gregg that had full place settings for 36 people. The receipt further indicates that Hayden and Gregg billed Manning $35 for a case for silver lined with velvet, plus another $3 for the engraving of his name on a silver plate affixed to the top. Charleston silversmith Hayden and Gregg were also a Manning source for lighting used throughout the house, including the pair of hanging lanterns in the entrance hall. Affixed from a chain, each lantern could be raised and lowered for cleaning or adding oil to its reservoir. Gilt bronze torchiere candelabras, several of which remain in the house, provided additional lighting in the public spaces. Both the hanging lanterns and the candelabras were electrified in the 20th century and continue to illuminate Millford's interior more than 180 years later. Other examples of lighting found in our collection, while not original to Millford, evoke the type of lighting Manning purchased for the house. For example, this pair of astral lamps was made by British manufacturer T.C. Salt and retailed in New York around 1840. Astral lamps were a type of oil lamps with a flattened circular reservoir that casted no shadow. So really, this was an improvement on the earlier argon lamps with the technological innovation. Now, one way that Manning sought to manifest his wealth and status at Millford was through the display of artwork. Two especially interesting busts displayed in the entrance hall were among the works of art that he purchased from an Italian-born dealer and U.S. diplomat named Joseph or Giuseppe Binda. Born to a noble family in the Tuscan city-state of Lucca, Binda was a sometime American diplomat after he became a naturalized citizen in 1841 and full-time salesman. He actually married Fanny Sumter in 1825, a granddaughter of General Thomas Sumter. They were actually married in Paris and returned with the family to South Carolina. The attribution and provenance of some of the artwork Manning purchased from Binda is questionable, such as works the dealer claimed were bought from a Roman cardinal or paintings that formerly hung in a Spanish royal palace. And I could give an entire lecture on Binda. He's a fascinating person. But the ancient sculptures that he sold to Manning are, for lack of a better term, married pieces. They're 1st or 2nd century Roman heads affixed to 18th century marble or alabaster shoulders. Alabaster in the sense of for the female bust. But in a way that makes them more interesting. The busts help Manning to present Millford as his personal embodiment of classical taste. This painting of Roman ruins is another one that Manning purchased from Binda. It was initially believed to be by the 18th century Roman artist Giovanni Panini, but has since been reattributed to 17th century artist Viviano Codazzi. The busts and this painting are just some of the original artwork that Mr. Jenrette was able to return to the house and are found there today as part of our collection. Additional examples are the portraits of John and Susan Hampton Manning by Charleston artist James DeVoe that I've already shown several times tonight. Manning was 22 when he set for DeVoe in New York in 1838. At Manning's invitation, the artist traveled to Sumter County and painted portraits of Manning's family members, including John's widowed mother, also in our collection. The portrait of Manning's father in our collection may be an earlier work by DeVoe. Governor Manning actually died in 1836, so he predeceased DeVoe's trip out to Sumter County. The artist enjoyed the patronage of the Hampton and Manning families, and they financed additional training in Europe, where he tragically died in Rome in 1844. This later, circa 1844-45 portrait of Susan is attributed to William Harrison Scarborough. It was probably completed about a year before Susan's death, which resulted from complications from childbirth. Scarborough painted several of Susan's Hampton relatives as well. Susan was just 29 when she died on October 31st, 1845. She was buried adjacent to her father in Columbia's Trinity Church. 3 years later, John Laurence Manning married 19-year-old Sally Bland Clark of Virginia, whom he met at White Sulphur Springs. Sally's first impression of Millford, found in a letter to her mother, provides us one of the few period descriptions we have of the house prior to the Civil War. John Laurence Manning had a lengthy career in the South Carolina State Legislature and served as governor of South Carolina from 1852 to 1854. Shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War, he and Sally set for artist George Peter Alexander Healy. You can see Healy's signature on the canvas there to the left of Manning's shoulder. Manning's portrait has returned to Millford, but the companion portrait of Sally remains in a private family collection. Another recent acquisition from last year is this carte de visite of John Laurence Manning, stamped Quinby and Company, Charleston. Thanks to an entry in Mary Boykin Chestnut's well-known diary, we know the exact date that Manning set for this portrait, April 2nd, 1861. Chestnut describes how John Laurence Manning invited her to go with a group that included Mr. and Mrs. Simmons and Alan Izzard to Quinby's studio for portraits. Among the Manning silver in our collection is the stunning Ewer by Storr and Mortimer of London. It's got John Laurence Manning's monogram on it as well. A wedding chalice presented to Manning by his future mother-in-law on the occasion of his 1848 wedding to Sally is by New York silversmiths Ball, Tompkins, and Black. And here's a waste bowl from a larger tea service by Baltimore silversmith Samuel Kirk. This is actually the only piece we have in the collection of what was presumably a larger family tea service. While John and Susan relied on Hayden and Gregg in Charleston, receipts and extant pieces suggest that Sally Bland Manning preferred Samuel Kirk of Baltimore for her silver. While not original to Millford, this circa 1840 portrait of politician Henry Clay in the Stair Hall provides an opportunity to discuss Manning's visit to the politician's Lexington, Kentucky estate during an 1837 trip through Kentucky. While visiting Ashland, Clay's plantation, Manning dined with the statesman, describing the visit in a detailed letter to Sally, seen here in his papers. This bust of another prominent 19th century politician, President Andrew Jackson, is by Ferdinand Petrick and is found in the dining room. Born in Dresden, Petrick trained in Rome with Thorvaldsen. After working briefly in Philadelphia, he arrived in Washington in 1836, and it was actually through a letter of introduction from Thomas Sully to Ralph Earl, who was Jackson's artist in residence during his administration, and actually, I believe, Jackson's nephew by marriage, too, that Petrick was able to get this portrait, who was able to sculpt Jackson. And this is a copy. I believe at least 5 are known, but it's amazing just how Jackson's hair is rendered. And you can just see, so the shock of his hair and just the waves of the hair very artfully rendered in the marble. Of course, one of the most significant aspects of our collection is the original Duncan Phyfe furniture. As I noted earlier, we are so fortunate to have nearly 60 pieces at Millford. Mr. Jenrette loved this furniture and continued to acquire examples until his 2018 death, and Classical American Homes has continued acquiring them. The most recent acquisition that I'll discuss momentarily took place just a few months ago. By 1840, Duncan Phyfe was in the twilight of his career, in partnership with a son and producing furniture in what is considered his final stylistic evolution, his Grecian plain style. Whereas earlier Phyfe furniture from the 1820s, like the Donaldson sofa in our collection at Edgewater, relied on finely carved details, stenciling, stamped brass ornaments, gilding, and vert antique decoration, the Grecian plain style of circa 1840 omitted all of those details in favor of sweeping curves and highly polished mahogany and rosewood veneers. It's truly stunning furniture, in part because of this simplicity. In addition to the 57 pieces in our collection, original Millford pieces can be found in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Columbia Museum of Art, and in private family collections. At Millford, we're so fortunate because we can exhibit this furniture in the setting in which it was intended to be used. I mean, how often do you get to see furniture by Duncan Phyfe or any other 19th century cabinet maker in its original context? Like the massive extension table and chairs in the dining room it was made for, or the window seats beneath the double parlor windows. There's actually a hierarchy of furniture in the house. The entrance hall furniture was made of walnut. The dining room and most of the bedrooms featured mahogany furniture, and the double parlor, the most formal space in the house, as well as Manning's principal bedchamber, featured furniture of rosewood. The entrance hall suite included 4 Grecian couches and a pair of marble-topped sideboard tables. We have this amazing photograph that I've already shown several times showing the space in about 1900. And you can see that furniture in situ as well as a set of armchairs that was part of the same suite. Today, all 4 of the Grecian couches have returned to Millford. 3 are presented in their Jenrette era silk upholstery, but the 4th, acquired in 2019, was reupholstered following an investigation which uncovered evidence of the original faux leather fabric and brass tacks from its Manning era appearance. For the double parlor, the furniture was made of Brazilian rosewood, the most fashionable and expensive wood of that era. The mirrored folding doors at the center of the space allowed the large space to be presented as a single room or separated into 2 smaller rooms with identical suites of furniture on each side: a sofa, couches, occasional tables, stools, ottomans, side chairs, and window seats. Today, the double parlor is decorated in its Jenrette era color scheme of light blue and gold, but fragments of original fabric in the Metz collection provide clues about the Manning era color. The silk damask fabric features a meandering floral pattern in gold on a crimson background. It was reproduced for the 2011 Met Phyfe exhibition, and several pieces, including the sofa from the double parlor, were upholstered in the reproduction fabric. Each corner of the room featured a marble-topped corner table. We recently acquired the 4th example, so now we have all 4 of this distinct form. The space also featured 2 round marble-topped stands, and on the underside of one marble top is this pencil notation, J.L. Manning, a very interesting survival. Each side of the parlor also featured an occasional table, one of which is in our collection. While much of the table is made of rosewood, the scrolled supports are actually mahogany that was faux grained to resemble rosewood. The banquette-shaped seats, called ottomans during the time period, are an especially interesting furniture form. They would have been laden with bolsters and pillows and used for lounging. Much of the double parlor furniture, including the banquettes, feature casters, further illustrating its portability within the space. So pieces could be moved around the room as needed and to suit whatever activity was taking place within it. The tabaret stools were also intended to be portable and could have served a variety of uses. Susan Manning was known to have played the pedal harp, and one of these stools could have easily served as a music stool for that purpose. This particular example that I'm highlighting from our collection was deupholstered to remove modern 20th century springs and upholstery fabric, but it will be reupholstered and eventually returned to the double parlor. The dining room featured a large oval mahogany extension table that complemented the adjacent elliptical wall. The table features a richly veneered, faceted central pedestal that can accommodate 5 leaves when fully extended. French-style armchairs were placed around the table. We have 12 of the original 16 chairs and several modern copies. Some evidence from their reupholstering suggested that the dining chairs may have originally been covered in that same faux leather fabric that we see originally in the entrance hall as well. The sarcophagus-formed cellaret that holds 6 bottles would have been stored beneath the sideboard table and rolled out and opened up for use during dinner parties. Here are 2 examples of side chairs from the commission. Several from this suite, featuring its distinctive peaked crest, appear in a circa 1900 photograph of the double parlor. Though hidden under summer slip covers, the silhouette of that distinctive crest is apparent. Roman numerals suggest there were at least 16 chairs in this suite. The second type of chair, slightly just a little more Gothic-y, is actually part of a suite of at least 8 chairs. This particular example that I photographed to include here, you can see there's the Roman numeral on its frame right there. So it's number 6. For the principal bedchamber, Phyfe supplied a suite of rosewood furniture, including a Grecian bedstead, a basin stand, a dressing mirror, a marble-top nightstand, and a marble-top nightstand that was kept adjacent to the bed and used to conceal a chamber pot. So that's this little sort of drum-shaped table with the marble top on the far right. Open up the cabinet, that's where the chamber pot would have been kept. Last but not least, there was a large rosewood wardrobe. The wardrobe is our latest acquisition. It had been in another museum collection for almost 70 years, so we are thrilled to be able to return it to Millford to rejoin other pieces from the principal bedchamber. The doors would have originally featured mirrored glass. The secondary bedchambers featured equally impressive suites of mahogany furniture, including French bedsteads, smaller wardrobes, a dressing mirror, a mahogany nightstand, like the rosewood example that I showed you in the previous slide, and a double basin stand. The basin stand was intended to hold 2 porcelain wash basins. In other words, it was the double bathroom vanity of the 19th century. Here in his pattern book, George Smith even provides suggestions for where to arrange particular toiletries upon the top. All the beds Phyfe provided are French-style beds, what we might call a sleigh bed. In contrast to an English-style bedstead placed perpendicular to the wall, these beds were intended to be placed lengthwise against the wall. They also featured canopies or crowns suspended from a hook on the ceiling with cascading bed curtains. One of my ongoing research projects has focused on this suite of armchairs. Featuring a Gothic crest and lotus supports on the arms, the form shows the influence of Restoration-era French furniture as Phyfe was undertaking the Millford Commission. 4 of these chairs are in the double parlor, and a 5th example was acquired in 2020. I was able to acquire a 6th example from the suite in 2021 from another Manning descendant. Each chair frame contains a Roman numeral, suggesting the suite included at least 8 chairs. The last 2 chairs, acquired in 2020 and 2021, both passed down through Manning's direct descendants. You can even see one of the chairs in this early 20th century image of the Camden residence of Manning's daughter. If you'll also notice to the left of the chair, there's one of the original window seats. And of course, just above the mantle is that DeVoe portrait of John Laurence Manning that I've featured several times already tonight. Examination by a furniture conservator revealed some interesting evidence on the 2021 chair, and its catalog number is 2021-001. So I'm just going to refer to it as the 2021 chair this evening. While the frame featured Roman numeral 5, the slip seat had Roman numeral 7. Examination of the other chairs in the suite revealed a similar phenomenon, suggesting that they were all intermixed at some point. After the modern upholstery was removed, an examination of the seat frame revealed evidence of the earliest upholstery campaign. A few threads of a pale yellow wool damask identified microscopically on the seat. The chair frame had a few pale pink and green cotton yarns attached to an early gimp pin, but no evidence of that same pale yellow fabric observed on the seat. If these chairs were used in the double parlor, then they in theory should have been upholstered en suite with the rest of the double parlor and would have contained some evidence of that fabric I discussed earlier. Does the lack of that fabric and the presence of the yellow wool damask on the seat, originally from chair 7, and the pale pink and green yarns on the frame, marked Roman numeral 5, suggest these chairs were used in different locations of the house? I think it definitely throws in some interesting questions, and obviously we need more evidence. So that's going to involve testing some other chairs from the same suite to see what sort of evidence they suggest about where these chairs were used. Were some of them used in the parlor? Were some used in other spaces of the house? But it's really amazing what sort of evidence you can find, that a trained upholstery conservator can find looking at historical furniture like this of earlier upholstery campaigns. The last thing I'll say about the Phyfe Commission is that we were very fortunate to have so much documentation about its transport and delivery to Millford, including that letter I cited earlier. We actually have the original bill of lading in our collection as well that indicates exactly which crates held specific pieces of furniture. And here's a transcription, so you can easily read it and see the variety. And again, this wasn't even for the full order. This was just for a portion of the order. Window treatments, bed hangings, and decorative pillows were supplied by Phyfe and brother, nephews of the cabinet maker. Their surviving invoice and correspondence in our collection suggests they provided 18 pairs of window curtains, as well as bed curtains, pillows, bolsters, and bedding. Several notable pieces at Millford are the result of Mr. Jenrette's 5 decades of collecting classical New York furniture. In addition to Phyfe, he collected pieces by the cabinet maker's contemporaries, including French immigrant cabinet maker Charles-Honoré Launouet, a pair of circa 1810 brackets in the form of winged griffins are attributed to Launouet and displayed in the entrance hall. And there's, of course, more Phyfe. The circa 1830 open back couch is another example from Phyfe's shop, as is the library table from 1840. I wanted to also briefly highlight a few examples of ceramics in the collection tonight, like this mid-18th century Chinese export porcelain lotus punch bowl, which speaks to Mr. Jenrette's interest in collecting Chinese porcelain and decorative arts, something that he credited decorator Anthony Hale with encouraging him to do in the 1960s. Hale decorated several of Mr. Jenrette's earlier houses in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There are also numerous examples of 18th and 19th century French porcelain throughout the house, and this is one of my favorites, this set of circa 1810 Paris porcelain vases that feature equestrian scenes displayed in the library. Speaking of ceramics, a very interesting object group are the codestone roundels hanging in the library. Codestone, originally known as lithotopyra, or stone fired twice, was created in the late 18th century by Eleanor Code and had a number of uses. And I should say also that the artificial stone manufactory of Code in London was active until the 1830s. The roundels were actually installed in the first floor dining room at Roper House by Mr. and Mrs. Solomon Guggenheim around 1930. So this is a picture of that space. They were removed during Mr. Jenrette's renovation of Roper House in the early 1980s and then installed here in the library at Millford. So very interesting provenance. The collection also includes a small group of Manning family letters and documents. This frame contains tickets for balls held during Lafayette's 1825 visit to South Carolina that was part of his national tour made at the invitation of President James Monroe. He spent a great deal of time, he visited all the states that existed at the time, and basically every city and place he went had parties and balls and such. Manning's father, Richard Irvine Manning, was governor of South Carolina during Lafayette's visit, and several of the tickets in the frame are for his attendance to balls where he accompanied Lafayette at Fort Moultrie, or one actually down at Seabrook Plantation on Edisto Island. Interesting aside about that one, the steamboat that Lafayette and Governor Manning were on actually en route from Charleston to Edisto actually was delayed, so they actually missed the ball. They didn't get to Edisto until the next morning, much to the chagrin of all the people at the ball waiting to meet Lafayette. Here's actually a letter that John wrote to Sally just prior to their marriage from Montgomery, Alabama, while he's traveling en route to his Louisiana plantations in 1848. And finally, we have the pardon issued to Manning by President Andrew Johnson. On May 29, 1865, Johnson issued a proclamation of general amnesty, pardoning anyone who participated in the Confederacy. However, individuals who fell under certain categories had to make application directly to the president. Manning was required to do so because of the value of his property, not because of his brief service in the Confederate Army or because he signed the Ordinance of Secession for South Carolina, but he references the 13th section, which deals with property value, because his property was valued in excess of $20,000. John L. Manning was financially ruined by the Civil War. In fact, in 1873, Millford was even sold at a sheriff's sale, where a cousin purchased the estate, deeding it to Manning's wife, Sally. Manning and Sally lived in Camden the final decades of their life, and Manning died in 1889. In 1902, his heirs sold Millford to Mary Clark Thompson, a New York widow, and this portrait of her on loan from her descendants is in Millford's dining room. Thompson and her family used the estate as a family retreat for hunting, fishing, wing shooting, horseback riding, and driving. Upon her death, she bequeathed Millford to her nephews, and Mr. Jenrette purchased it from their descendants in 1992. In 2008, Mr. Jenrette gave Millford to Classical American Homes. The property is open for regular tours and special programs. We also use the buildings and the significant collection as a learning laboratory to help train the next generation of historic preservationists, as well as curators and museum collections managers. I also want to invite you to further explore some of the objects I've discussed this evening, so please check out the Millford section of our online catalog. So with that, I'm going to end my screen sharing here. I'm going to start my video again, and I'm happy to, Joe, if you can, we can start answering some questions now if we have any.
Yeah, thanks. We got a question here about, do you have any idea how much Manning paid for the Phyfe furniture?
No, I wish we did. There are many things, again, we know about it, but we don't know the full price. I imagine based on contemporary commissions, it was probably a pretty sizable amount. And again, he's purchasing again, like I said, the most formal spaces of the house are all rosewood, which again was the most expensive and popular wood of that era. So I mean, Manning is sparing absolutely no expense on any of this. That's a document that I hope we will eventually be able to find, and that's a question I hope we'll be able to answer. So if we do find more evidence on that, I'll certainly write a blog entry about it.
And that leads to another question that we had. Are there, and you addressed this some in your talk, but are there any missing documented pieces that we are searching for?
Yes, there are a number of pieces, actually. We know that in the dining room, there were corner cabinets, there were dumbwaiters, there were, I believe, knife boxes. I'm going to briefly jump back to my slide with the inventory on there, and that will help me. Okay. Yes, there are, I'm just scrolling down through here. But yeah, there are a number of forms that we do not know of that are not extant. Some may be extant. We just don't know about them. It amazes me what pieces that I had no record of, where I get a phone call one day and somebody says, I have a piece of furniture that I think may have been from Millford. And sure enough, it's a matching piece to an extant piece in the collection. And it's, what's so significant about this commission is it's the largest documented commission that was made to Duncan Phyfe in the almost 60 years that he was in business.
It's pretty remarkable. Here's a great question, which I'll let you segue to a great story. How did the house survive so intact during the Civil War?
There's a great story about that, and I go into detail about this in my other lecture. So around the time of the end of the Civil War, General Potter and his staff, who are in South Carolina, ride up to Millford, and they are received by John Laurence Manning. They all go up to the roof and they survey the area around the plantation. And there's sort of an apocryphal story that Potter finds out that his relative, Nathaniel Potter of Rhode Island, was sort of the master builder, contractor, whatever term you want to call him, for the construction of Millford. So there's this apocryphal story that he says, one Potter built it so another will not burn it down. Again, don't know if that's true or not, but we do have documentation, again, of General Potter visiting. We have a great visitor account from a doctor who was actually the surgeon, the regimental surgeon for the 54th Massachusetts, who accompanies that group of officers who goes to Millford that day in April of 1865. And it's amazing because he talks about the Manning ladies are in their dresses are much darned, and John Laurence Manning's pants are, clearly, basically the family has, already met on hard financial times. And the other interesting thing about that letter is Dr. Briggs was his name. Sorry, it took me a minute to think about that. But Dr. Briggs comments about, you can see the, I forget his exact wording, but just the flood of recently emancipated and formerly enslaved individuals walking down the road in front of Millford. Because basically one of the things that Potter's raids, as they were known, one of the things they did was emancipate a lot of enslaved individuals on the plantations in the vicinity around Millford. And you can actually look in the historic records of the church, St. Mark's, that's there associated with Millford, that has in its records enslaved individuals associated with Millford, who it actually notes that they left as the result of Potter's raid, that they were emancipated at that time.
Great. One other question. Do we know where Manning lived in Camden?
Yes, he actually he lived with his daughter, who actually lived at Sarsfield, which was a house associated with Mary Boykin Chestnut. John Laurence Manning's daughter, Ellen, actually married David Williams, who was Mary Boykin Chestnut's favorite niece. Of course, Mary Boykin Chestnut had no children of her own, so he was one of the recipients of a bequest from her estate. They actually, so that's Sarsfield was the name of the house, and it is still, it's a private home today, but it's still standing in Camden. And it's very interesting because Mary Clark Thompson's nephew, who actually went down to see the property to sort of preview Millford for her before she purchased it in 1902, talks about seeing it with Mr. Williams, Manning's son-in-law. Of course, Manning is deceased by this time, but they said Mary Clark Thompson's nephew writes that nobody had lived at Millford for 20 years, basically in the main house. So basically, it was in. Things were, it was very worn. Some part of the roof was needed to be repaired, but yeah.
That's great. We got a question. Where did the emancipated slaves go? Yeah, I don't know that. Not sure that we have an answer to that.
Yeah, but I will say, we don't know. We do know a number of individuals formerly enslaved at Millford actually continue to work on the property as as a caretaker capacity. For example, Benjamin Pleasance, who was Manning's former enslaved valet, actually lives out the rest of his life post-emancipation at Millford, acting as a caretaker during that time when nobody's living in the main house, and even into the time of Mary Clark Thompson's ownership. And so we have photographs of Benjamin Pleasant standing next to a building that's associated with him. And the same with Ann Johnson, who is a formerly enslaved woman at Millford, who also too lives out the rest of her life there as in a caretaker capacity as well. And this is something that, again, we're fortunate to have a lot of research on them. I go into a lot more detail about that in my earlier lecture, so I encourage people to check that out.
I think this is our last question. Can you comment on the spring house that looks like Trinity Cathedral, Columbia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting building. We have a lot of questions about it. It's not on the construction documentation where Nathaniel Potter, the builder, and John Laurence Manning signed the sort of articles of agreement of what all is going to be built. But we know that it was completed by 1843 because Edmund Ruffin is traveling through that part of South Carolina and writes in his journal about visiting Millford. Of course, the house is locked up, so he doesn't get inside. I wish he had been able to, because that would be another great description of the interior about as early as possible. But he writes about that spring house, and mean, it's just, yes, it looks very much like Trinity Church, a very sort of Gothic design. It's, yeah, sorry, I had another thought, but it completely escaped me. But yeah, it's an 1840s original structure. And the other interesting thing I'll say about it is that spring, was used. Actually, Manning incorporated the latest technology into building Millford. There was actually through the aid of a water ram, water could actually be, through a system of lead pipes, be brought up from that spring to the water tower that's behind the house, and then distributed to the dependencies, the kitchen and the laundry buildings that were directly behind the main house. He actually had a forced air furnace system in the house as well. There's a brass grate still in the center of the floor in the entrance hall from that system too. So he clearly incorporates the latest technology in the house, as well as sparing no expense in getting, materials are coming from Rhode Island, New York. The marble for the mantles is coming from Philadelphia, from Struthers Marble Yard, the same marble yard where, George Washington's sarcophagus from the new tomb at Mount Vernon was sourced. And, he's ordering, French, the large mirrored plate glass over the mantles is coming from a firm in New York City that's getting it from France. The silver door hardware, he's sparing no expense in the construction and furnishing of this house.
And I think we got a wonderful last question here that you've referenced your earlier lectures before. Where can folks go to find those?
They are all on YouTube. So you can just, for that one, search my name and Millford, and it will, I tested that earlier and it will come up. So
yeah, those lectures were done through the North Carolina Museum of History. And so those are on the North Carolina Museum of History's YouTube channel. But we'll make sure, I think on our website, we may have a link to those, but if not, in our next newsletter, we'll make a way to point those out. Grant, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. We anticipate having a version of this up on our own YouTube channel at some point in the very near future. And we thank you all for coming tonight and for all your great questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.